Good evening, Chair, board members of the board, Dr. Faust. As you know, our New Hanover County Schools policies and professional development are based on several key tenets around student behavior. All students must be treated with respect. Students can and should be taught the skills and behaviors needed for success. Motivation and responsibility should be encouraged through positive interactions and building those relationships with students. Student misbehavior provides a teaching opportunity, and collaboration in this is critical. All school staff members work together to help students behave responsibly and to meet those students' needs. Am I clicking? We're going to cover 4 main points. The first one, what do we know about our own data? Beyond that, we're going to dig into regulations and policies in place with regard to IDEA, OCR, and our local school board policies, our obligation to respond, and then what sanctions exist for us. So the first piece, digging into our own data. What do we know about discipline by the numbers? And this is summary data for you from last school year, as the last completed school year. How many office discipline referrals resulted in out-of-school suspension? So we had 2,712 office discipline referrals in the 21-22 school year. 16% resulted in out-of-school suspension. So that's how many office discipline referrals we had that resulted in OSS. I will tell you that that is a reduction from pre-pandemic school years where we had total school year data. The previous school year prior to that, we had pre-pandemic in the year 18-19, we had 2,936. And the year prior to that, we were at 3,487. So continuous reduction. What do we know about out-of-school suspensions by grade? Well, we know that 7th, 8th, and 9th graders make up almost half of all students suspended. As we do a breakdown of out-of-school suspension by race, you can see by the percentages listed here, African American students are suspended at a rate almost 6 times more than their peers. Just as concerningly, African American students with disabilities are suspended out of school at a rate almost 4.5 times greater than their peers. What I want to highlight for you is that New Hanover County Schools is the only district in North Carolina among 115 school districts that is significantly disproportionate in total out-of-school suspensions. The threshold for significant disproportionality is 3 times. We are at 4.5 times for our African American students with disabilities. Top offenses that result in the assignment of out-of-school suspension are as follows. You see fighting at 28.8%, disrespect 20.5%, disruptive 20%, inappropriate behavior 15.7%, and aggressive behavior at 14.9%. I do have a question for you though. Someone please define for me what disrespect looks like. Anybody? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Oh, okay, interesting. So whatever definition you provide for me, I'm going to ask, does everyone explicitly agree with that definition? Right. Next, I'm going to go to the second bullet. What are the regulations and policies in place with regard to student discipline? In these, we're going to discuss the Individuals with Disability Education Act regulations, Office of Civil Rights rulings, and New Hanover County Schools policies. Not sure what's happening. Oops. So let's talk about what disproportionate representation and significant disproportionality really is. It's overrepresentation of certain students by race or ethnicity for special education services. There are 3 areas that this is calculated on. For us, it isn't about the more restrictive placement options or the identification, it's about the disciplinary removals. Within the parameters of federal regulations, each state has to adopt procedures and processes to address whether this significant disproportionality and whether it exists in identification, placement, or discipline. Again, for us, it's discipline. There is a sanction. The parameters further require the reservation of funds, and when I say the parameters of the federal regulation, requires that the district with significant disproportionality reserve the maximum amount of federal funds received under the section of the Act, meaning IDEA, and that's 15%, to provide comprehensive early intervening services. In other words, to address the root causes of the disproportionality. This reserve or set aside must address the factors that contribute to disproportionality. Therefore, those funds cannot be used for the overall services of the EC or special education program. 15% of the IDEA funds the district receives are not able to be used toward the overall services for students with disabilities. That amount of sanction over the past 5 years is more than $4.5 million. And I go on to say that needs to be returned to the special education program by way of reducing the disproportionality. The regulations require specifically the promotion of equity in IDEA. The process for determination of significant disproportionality, as I mentioned, for this promotion of equity in IDEA is explained as identifying and addressing the factors that contribute to significant disproportionality, addressing any policy, practice, or procedure that contributes to, and then reporting publicly any of these changes. I also need to share with you some rulings from the Office of Civil Rights that require our response. So the Office of Civil Rights is just as concerned by statistical evidence, as I have highlighted here, so I'm not reading everything to you word for word. Statistical evidence of discriminatory effect. So this is the difference between intent and what outcomes look like. Even when we believe we are treating similarly situated students the same, such as everyone involved in the fight gets out of school suspension. It's still, when the outcome still weighs more heavily on students of a particular race, we still find ourselves in disproportionality. So more clearly, equal responses to student behaviors that don't lead to equal outcomes for students by race is still disproportionality. Furthermore, the Office of Civil Rights is concerned with the application of discretionary or subjective infractions, such as defiance, disruption, inappropriate behavior, because these less objective infractions are more susceptible to racial bias. As we will go back and review our top offenses that result in out-of-school suspension, more than half, in fact 56.2% of those, are extremely subjective: inappropriate behavior, disruptive, and disrespect. Third bullet, what is our obligation to respond? How do we engage in root cause analysis? And what policy and process reform are required or incumbent upon us? I want to bring your attention to commentary from the Safe and Civil Schools, which is the root of leadership and behavior support training we've been providing in the district. Research, 20-year body of research, schools across the nation. Research consistently indicates that the most influential factor in establishing a positive, proactive learning environment is leadership. The principal sets the tone. Therefore, who did we ask what the root causes are? Principals. So I'm sharing with you a few slides here of their responses of root causes in their own handwriting, and then I'm going to provide for you a summary slide that has multiple bullets. So I'll give you a few minutes to look over the pictures, and then I'm going to move on. And again, I have them summarized in a bulleted slide. So I'm going to move to the next. One more. As succinctly bulleted here for you, the first column addresses root causes. The second column are what principals identified as strategies to address, not necessarily lining up bullet by bullet. I want to highlight for you root cause. The top addressed at issues as root cause: mental health and trauma of students, a lack of de-escalation training or use of de-escalation in adult responses, implicit bias and cultural bias, perceiving that this behavior is disrespect from this student, but another student engages in it. I don't necessarily see that as disrespect. I see that as self-advocacy, that kind of thing. Old school supervision attitudes, lack of student success, lack of classroom engagement, hunger basic need deficiencies, high concentration of needs in certain schools, lack of adequate supervision in high traffic areas. I'm sorry to read these, but I have to highlight them. Social deficits, a lack of connection and relationship, things happening in social media, lack of communication skills, pressure from stakeholders for an easy out. OSS is called the easy out. Punitive mindset in schools, and a lack of use of restorative practices. These are from the words of principals. Principals also identified the second column as what we need to be doing to address these: trauma-informed teaching, professional development, counselor lessons in social emotional learning, modeling and teaching the de-escalation for staff, reteaching replacement behaviors for our students, staff professional development in responding to student behaviors, changing lens from punitive to teaching and restorative practices, relationship building among students and families, increasing professional development for our adults on conflict resolution and power struggles. They want a district restorative practices plan versus their individual school plan. They want proactive communication with families and celebration of successes, and they want effective academic interventions. We know that out-of-school suspension is not an intervention. So, our New Hanover County Schools policies, local policies, the 4300 series. In the past, we had one student code of conduct policy, policy 8410. In our policy manual revamp, we went to 18 student behavior policies. These policies were revised for the 21-22 school year, including the requirement for a range of consequences in each policy for each behavior strand. Principals and district leaders came together to create those range of consequences for each of those violations of student conduct. Those range of consequences are a graduated response, including instructive and restorative approaches. Many of what you saw identified in the strategies column from principals. In these, we must ensure that all school settings are safe and productive. No argument there. Create positive school climate with a high expectancy of student success. An expectancy of student success is a completely different trajectory than an expectancy of student failure or student removal. And then designing effective policies and procedures for prompting students to be responsible, highly motivated, and actively engaged in school tasks. Again, I'm going to remind you, New Hanover County Schools has the highest disproportionality rate in North Carolina. The only way to reinstate the funds, that 15% set aside for the sole use of students with disabilities, thus increasing their academic growth, is to continue to reduce overall disciplinary referrals, or OSS, from schools. And that's by implementing Policy 4302, our school plans for the management of student behavior, as were reviewed from school improvement plans back in the fall. Those plans guide our staff to be proactive, where problem behaviors are prevented before they begin, positive, where they're interacting with students in friendly and inviting ways, and instructional, where misbehavior is corrected calmly and consistently to teach students to behave more responsibly. And I'll leave you with this. Every student, regardless of race or disability, needs to be part of the growth for which New Hanover County Schools strives to be known. Thank you.
We talk about least restrictive environment for our EC kids. And a lot of the behaviors, if there are behaviors happening with our EC kids, are they in the mainstream classroom? And if so, are we looking at whether or not this truly is the least restrictive environment for those kids?
Absolutely. There is always a balance in the discussion of placement for a student with a disability. And when a student is engaging in behaviors that interfere with that kid's learning or the learning of others, that's when that placement determination has got to be discussed at an IEP meeting. And those, of course, are all very individualized. The real concern when addressing behavior in a vacuum is, have we looked at every potential or reasonable intervention being provided to reduce the likelihood that that problematic behavior is occurring? That's that assessment that we have to complete. And that's where you'll hear teams talking about a functional behavior analysis, where we're looking at what is really triggering or is the antecedent for the behavior, and then how are we responding to decrease the likelihood that that behavior actually works for the kid. Yeah, very much.
Ms. Varnam, I appreciate you hitting a lot of keynotes because you're talking about the input and the intentional input and the idea that we have subjective nature of interpretation to our range of consequences. And when I looked at it, I agree with you. When you talk about disrespect and discipline, it's going to look different in the eye of the beholder. So it's really important to get our stakeholders, our principals together to talk about ways that we are utilizing de-escalation strategies. And I want to bring up policy 4300 because it talks about in the very first paragraph, number 2, a system that ensures the equitable treatment of all students. And you said this, you said the intent behind something versus the outcome that happens. And I want to openly address this because I think this is something this board needs to come together with a work session, because we do have a lot of common ground, but unfortunately, over the last few years, we have heard the disciplinary practices of both suspension and seclusion being used in a way that teachers have not done those resources and implied that. And so what I hear back from staff is this, is, Josie, I have tried, I have de-escalated, I have pulled in teachers, I have admin, and I have kids who are violently aggressive, and I don't know what to do to keep my class maintained. And so what I am worried about is looking at the outcome and assuming everything is wrong, rather than looking at the outcome and say, let's brainstorming what we're doing right and what path we need to continue to go on to get those results we want to see. And so for me, and I've said this before, the idea and concept of virtue signaling the word equity, meaning everything's going to come out the same. This is what we've done the last few years, though, in leadership. We've said, let's just stop doing that practice. Just stop doing that practice. And then everyone says, well, what do I do? Rather than saying, let's change the focus on the input. And that's what we need to be doing, is changing the focus on the input, getting the support from our staff. And so as we move forward with this conversation, that's what I'd like to see, because I know there are things that we're doing. The first night that we came onto this board in December, we signed 3 times amount for a learning perspectives agreement. And what that did, it was a company comes in to evaluate whether or not our EC students are getting the supports they need and they're being effective in their environment. That's what we did. One of the first things that we did back in December. So I know that there are things that our district is doing. I know there are things that we need to work on. It is clear from the expectation. But what I'd like to do is, as we move forward with the focus, I want to focus on what we're inputting to get that versus just saying stop suspending, because the trickle down effect in some of our staff in schools is you are not allowed to punish if you have a child of color. You are not allowed to, because that's what equitable treatment is for kids. You can't have that result with a kid. And I'm just telling you the disconnect, and I'm telling you why there's such varying degrees of opinion of that word, because of the subjective nature of how some people interpret it.
And I will let you know, there has not been a direction or a directive not to suspend.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Walker. First, I want to say thank you for presenting in such an honest way and talking about disproportionality. The data is the data, and I think acknowledging it is a very important first step. Secondly, I appreciate the principals coming up with root causes, because until we address root causes, It doesn't matter if we change the word equity here, social emotional learning here. This is what it is. And there's a lot more to it than in understanding that we really need to dive into. I've talked about it in other cases. Poverty is the biggest driver of trauma. And until we address a lot of these root causes, I don't see how we're going to affect real change. And I know that's something the school district can't take care of on its own. That's something I hope the task force at least looks at and really has some honest conversation about. We can sit here and hash out what equity means or doesn't mean, but obviously we have definitions from our federal government about it, and it's embedded in our own county government in their strategic plan. It's not a scary word. It's not a word meant to say, oh, to me, and I think I've shared this with Mr. Manis, it's about opportunities and making sure that we are trying our best to understand the biases and the things that we hold and affect and change for our students. That is a big number. The disproportionality is a huge problem. I think it's been that way for a while. And I hope that we really have the real conversation about it, not whether one word means this or one word means that. I just think it's wasting time when this is the work that needs to be done.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of weigh in. One of the things that I was looking at before we talked about this was that educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop their full academic and social potential. And that's kind of what we saw with the principals. And I would expect that it would be different from building to building because the populations are different from building to building. So, I guess what I'm getting at is, are you, has our strategic plan and your actions, your strategies, your action steps, based on what you've shown us with this data, are you going to make changes to the strategic plan, or is it written out such that we have 5 years to do it and you're going along to meet those milestone action steps?
Yes, and I would echo what the principals provided as root cause analysis and strategies to address that, and being very much aligned to behavioral research and very much aligned to our strategic plan. Because what we offered as a part of our strategic plan is rooted in an evidence base around student discipline, student behaviors that are conducive to academic rigor and academic engagement. So yes, I find that they're very much aligned.
And so the follow-up, Mr. Wildebohr, so these things that we're talking about right here, they would fall under the pillar of school safety. Not the physical safety, but the people safety.
Definitely. Okay. And the creation of positive and proactive school cultures is a huge, if not the most appropriate or paramount deterrent for school safety inside the school building.
Correct.
Anyone else? Mr. McManus?
Yes, sir. I'm never lost for words. I'm lost for words. I've said this once before. Sounds like it fell on deaf ears. We got to get out of the box. I don't know what that means. We've been doing the same things and you get the same results. You got to go back and start over again. And we know the schools where this is happening. We've got to do something. We've got to get together. If it doesn't work, we try something else. But we've been sitting on this for a long time. We can't ignore it. In so many ways, and for a lot of reasons. Some probably still to come. But if it's the right thing to do, we got to deal with it. So we got a lot of smart people in this county. And a lot of thinkers and problem solvers. So what do we do? And we need to do it quickly. And this board cannot ignore that. If we don't agree on anything else, we cannot ignore what you just said to us.
I'm hoping, Mr. McManus, Ms. Walker has a task force, and when she needs us to pull in, she's brainstorming, and
putting this into action to say, how can we respond to the needs? We also have the all hands on deck that I think was a great idea that the last board had, to be able to plug people in to respond to the unique needs of every school. And I know that people say, you know, fix it, fix it. Sometimes it's manpower. Going in and being a volunteer makes a difference in kids' lives. Any one of our priority schools, pick them. Go in and say, principal, where do you need me? Because they'll plug you in. And we need to be proactive in saying that we want to do it.
Anyone else? If not, Ms. Varnum, thank you so much.